Bernie Sanders enters a secret Pentagon facility. The Cold War documents he finds expose a 50-year lie. Bernie Sanders pulled up to the Pentagon parking lot at 6:47 a.m. The early morning light casting long shadows across the concrete. His old Chevrolet looked out of place among the polished government vehicles. He sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, thinking about the path that had led him here. "You're really going through with this?" His aide David had asked him yesterday, concern etched on his face. "Damn right I am," Bernie had replied, shuffling through the clearance papers they'd spent months fighting for. "If what my source says is true, these documents could change everything." Now, stepping out of his car into the crisp morning air, those words echoed in his mind. His well-worn shoes scuffed against the pavement as he approached the security checkpoint. The morning drizzle was starting to dampen his characteristic wild hair, but he barely noticed. "ID and clearance, please," the first guard said mechanically. Young guy, probably mid-20s, with that military stiffness that seemed to come standard issue. Bernie handed over his credentials. "Senator Bernie Sanders, I have an appointment for document review in Section B." The guard's eyes flickered with recognition, but his face remained professionally blank. He scanned the documents carefully, then made a call. Bernie could hear fragments of the conversation. "Yes, sir. Section B7. 2 hours maximum." Oh, second guard approached. This one older, with gray at his temples. "Senator, I need you to surrender all electronic devices except for your cleared government phone." Bernie emptied his pockets, placing each item in a plastic bin. His personal phone, keys, wallet, everything that connected him to the outside world. The guard ran a metal detector over him with meticulous care. "Is all this really necessary?" Bernie asked, his Brooklyn accent sharp with irritation. "I've had top-secret clearance for years." The older guard met his eyes. "Different rules down in B7, Senator. Different world entirely." Something in the man's tone made Bernie pause. Was it a warning? Before he could ponder it further, a third security officer appeared. "This way, Senator. We'll start with biometric verification." The next 30 minutes were a blur of security protocols. Retinal scans, fingerprints, voice recognition. Each layer of security adding to the weight of what he was about to do. "Your palm is sweating, Senator," the technician noted during the handprint scan. "Need to dry it off for a clean read." "Wouldn't yours be?" Bernie shot back. "When you're about to dig through 50 years of government secrets." The technician didn't respond, but Bernie caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Finally cleared, he was led to an elevator that looked older than most of the staff in the building. The buttons only went up to 3, but the guard inserted a key into a hidden panel, revealing the lower levels. "B7, the guard announced, stepping back. "Someone will meet you down there." As the elevator descended, Bernie felt the temperature drop with each floor. B1, B2. The air grew noticeably staler. B3, B4. The lights flickered briefly. B5, B6. The elevator seemed to move slower, as if reluctant to reach its destination. B7. The doors opened to reveal a scene that seemed frozen in time. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over rows upon rows of filing cabinets, their metal surfaces dulled with age. The air smelled of old paper and secrets. Young woman in military dress stood waiting, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read, Lieutenant Sarah Chen. "Senator Sanders," she said crisply. "I'll be your archivist today. You have exactly 2 hours to review the approved documents. No extensions, no exceptions." Bernie nodded, taking in the endless rows of cabinets. "Where do we start, Lieutenant?" "Section 47C contains the files you're cleared for." She began walking, her footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. "I should remind you that while you can take notes on your cleared device, no other recording methods are permitted." They passed row after row of cabinets, each bearing cryptic numbering systems. Bernie caught glimpses of labels that made his pulse quicken. Cuban Contingency 1962. Moscow Channel Beta. Operation Morning Light. Tell me, Lieutenant, Bernie said as they walked. How long have you been working down here? That's not relevant to your review, Senator. Everything's relevant when you're dealing with history, young lady. She stopped at a cabinet marked 47C and pulled out a key. These files cover the period you requested, 1962 through 1965. I'll be stationed at the desk over there if you need assistance. Bernie watched her walk away, noting how she seemed to deliberately position herself where she could observe him without being obvious about it. He turned to the now open drawer, his fingers hovering over the folders within. Let's see what you've been hiding, he muttered, pulling out the first file. The initial documents seemed ordinary enough. Routine military assessments, logistics reports, personnel transfers. But as he dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. References to operations he'd never heard of. Names that appeared too frequently to be coincidental. Decision chains that didn't match the official record. Lieutenant, he called out after about 40 minutes of reading. These reports mention something called Project Starlight. I don't see the related files. Those would be in Section 50B, Senator. Outside your clearance level. Bernie looked up from the papers, fixing her with the stare he'd perfected over decades of congressional hearings. These documents clearly show Project Starlight was part of the same operation. You can't give me half the story and claim the other half is classified. I don't make the rules, Senator. No, you just follow them. He turned back to the files, but his mind was racing. The fragments he'd found so far suggested something bigger, something darker than even his source had hinted at. He worked methodically, his experienced eyes catching details that others might miss. Cross-references, date discrepancies, missing page numbers that hinted at removed documents. Each small discovery added to a growing sense of unease. Then he found it, buried in what looked like a routine budget report, a memo that made his blood run cold. Dated October 1963, it detailed decisions that had been deliberately hidden from Congress. Decisions that, if he was reading this correctly, had shaped decades of American history. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his government phone to take notes. The implications were staggering. If this memo was authentic, if the signatures on the bottom were real, Lieutenant Chen, he called out, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I need verification on something. She approached, her footsteps hesitant. Bernie held up the memo, pointing to a signature at the bottom. This name. Can you confirm this person's position in 1963? She studied the document, and Bernie saw the moment she realized what she was looking at. Her professional mask slipped for just a second, showing a flash of shock before she recovered. That information would be in the personnel files. Senator, I can check for you. Please do. As she walked to another section, Bernie continued reading, his heart pounding. The memo wasn't just about one decision. It was proof of a systematic program of deception. Names he recognized, respected historical figures, appeared in contexts that shattered their carefully maintained public images. Lieutenant Chen returned, her face carefully composed. The signature appears authentic, Senator. The individual in question held that position from 1961 through 1964. Bernie nodded slowly. Thank you, Lieutenant. And this whole time, you've been guarding these secrets down here. I maintain the archives, Senator. That's all. Is it? Young lady, do you know what's in these files? Really know? She didn't answer, but her silence spoke. Volumes. Bernie turned back to the drawer, pulling out more files with renewed purpose. Each document he read added another piece to a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for decades. The truth was here, buried in these basement files, hidden from the American people for half a century. He was so absorbed in his reading that he almost missed it. The slight change in the air pressure, the distant sound of elevator doors opening. Lieutenant Chen noticed it too. Her posture stiffened. Senator, she said quietly, how much more time do you need with these specific files? Bernie looked up, catching the warning in her tone. Why? Just an estimation, sir. More footsteps, these ones heavier, more purposeful. Bernie's political instincts, honed over countless battles, screamed that something was wrong. He turned his attention to the most damning documents, knowing his time might be running out. The evidence was clear now. There had been a shadow operation, a decision-making body that had bypassed all constitutional checks and balances. Their actions went beyond military readiness or national security. They had been actively manipulating global events. The footsteps grew closer. Lieutenant Chen's hand moved unconsciously to smooth her uniform, a nervous gesture that spoke volumes. That's when Bernie saw it. A folder marked Operation Sundown, the exact name his source had mentioned. He reached for it, but Lieutenant Chen stepped forward. "Senator, that section is still classified above your clearance." The footsteps were almost upon them now. Bernie had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast. The truth was within his grasp, but reaching for it could change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone involved. The weight of 50 years of lies hung in the air between him and that folder. And Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, who had spent his life fighting for truth and transparency, made his choice. The next few moments would set in motion events that would shake the foundations of American democracy. But for now, in that cold basement room filled with half a century of secrets, Bernie Sanders stood at the crossroads of history, about to take a step that could never be taken back. Bernie's voice cut through the tension. "Young lady, I've just found evidence of what may be the biggest cover-up in American history. That classification becomes irrelevant when it's being used to hide criminal activity." Lieutenant Chen's face showed an internal struggle. Years of training and duty wrestling with something deeper, her conscience. The footsteps were just around the corner now. "Senator, please," she started, but her voice trailed off as Bernie reached for the folder anyway. "You can stop me, Lieutenant," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "But then you'll have to live with that decision for the rest of your life." The moment stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Then, almost imperceptibly, she stepped back. It was a small movement, but it would change both their lives forever. Bernie grabbed the folder, his hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. Opening it revealed documents that made the previous discoveries seem trivial in comparison. His eyes widened as he scanned the first page. "Dear God," he whispered. The footsteps suddenly stopped. Voices murmured just beyond the row of cabinets. Lieutenant Chen's face had gone pale. "They're doing an unscheduled security sweep," she whispered urgently. "This isn't normal." Bernie's mind raced. "How long until they reach us?" 2 minutes, maybe less. He turned back to the documents, reading as fast as he could while still absorbing the horrifying details. His government phone came out, and he began photographing key pages with trembling fingers. "Senator, I could lose everything for this," Lieutenant Chen said. But she moved to block the view from the main aisle anyway. "They could destroy these files as soon as they realize what I've found," Bernie replied, still photographing. "Sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost, Lieutenant. I learned that lesson long ago." The voices grew closer. Bernie could make out fragments of conversation now. "Full sweep of Section 47. Unauthorized access possible. Secure all sensitive materials." Lieutenant Chen's voice was barely audible. 30 seconds, Senator." Bernie finished photographing the last crucial page just as the footsteps rounded the corner. He slipped the phone into his pocket and turned to face the approaching security team, Operation Sundown's folder still in his hands. 3 men in dark suits stood before them, their expressions unreadable. The leader, a gray-haired man with cold eyes, spoke first. "Senator Sanders, this is an unscheduled security sweep. We'll need to review any materials you've accessed." Bernie felt the weight of the photos on his phone like a physical burden. Everything he'd discovered, everything he'd fought to uncover, hung in the balance of the next few moments. "Of course," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Lieutenant Chen has been supervising my review. Everything has been by the book." The security team leader's eyes flickered to the young lieutenant, who managed to maintain her composure despite her evident fear. "Is that correct, Lieutenant?" She straightened, her spine meeting his gaze. "Yes, sir. The senator has followed all protocols." The leader nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Bernie. "We'll still need to verify the materials, Senator. Standard procedure." As Bernie handed over the files, he could feel the phone in his pocket, heavy with secrets that could shake the nation to its core. The security team began their review, methodically checking each document he'd accessed. The minutes crawled by like hours. Bernie watched as they cataloged everything, knowing that his next moves would have to be perfect. One mistake, one wrong word, and 50 years of buried truth might stay buried forever. Finally, the team leader looked up. "Everything appears to be in order, Senator. However, your time slot has expired. We'll escort you back to the surface." Bernie nodded, gathering his things with deliberate slowness. As he turned to leave, he caught Lieutenant Chen's eye one last time. No words were exchanged, but an understanding passed between them. They had both just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The elevator ride back to the surface felt surreal. Bernie stood surrounded by the security team, his mind already racing with what needed to be done next. The photos on his phone could expose decades of lies, but they could also put him, and others, in grave danger. As he emerged from the Pentagon's underground facility into the late morning sun, Bernie Sanders knew that the real battle was just beginning. The truth he'd discovered would either see the light of day, or he'd die trying to expose it. The weight of history rested in his pocket, and the clock was already ticking. The drive home from the Pentagon was a blur. Bernie's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel of his old Chevrolet. The weight of his government phone felt like a live grenade in his pocket. "Get it together, Bernard," he muttered to himself, using his full name like his father used to. He needed a secure place to examine what he'd found. Not his office. Too many eyes. Not his home. Too obvious. He pulled into a small diner he frequented off the beaten path. Mary, the elderly waitress who'd been serving him breakfast for years, noticed something was off immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Bernie," she said, pouring his usual coffee without asking. "Maybe I have, Mary. Maybe I have." He settled into his corner booth, well away from windows and other customers. "Could use some privacy today." Mary nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd seen enough politicians in her decades in D.C. to know when something big was brewing. "I'll keep 'em away, honey." Once alone, Bernie carefully took out his secure phone. His hands were steadier now as he began examining the photos he'd taken, starting with the earliest documents from 1962. "Son of a bitch," he whispered, coffee growing cold and forgotten. The first set of documents revealed a pattern that made his stomach churn. There had been a secret committee, operating completely outside constitutional authority. Names jumped out at him. People who'd held public office, who'd testified before Congress, who'd shaped American policy. But here, in these classified papers, they wore very different faces. He pulled out his reading glasses, squinting at a particularly damning memo. Committee Directive, 17B Top Secret. Eyes Only. October 12, 1962. Implementation of Protocol Sigma. Successful. Congress remains unaware of true scope. Recommend continued compartmentalization. Bernie's phone buzzed, making him jump. A text from his trusted aide, David. "Everything okay? You missed the 11 a.m. call." Bernie texted back carefully. "Need to meet. The usual place. Bring Jane." His wife Jane would know something was very wrong if he was pulling her into this, but he needed her sharp mind right now. The diner's bell chimed as new customers entered. Bernie quickly locked his phone. Mary appeared with a fresh cup of coffee. "More folks coming in, Bernie. Want me to run interference?" "Thanks, Mary. Just finishing up." An hour later, Bernie sat in the back room of his favorite bookstore, a place he'd used for sensitive meetings for years. The owner, an old civil rights activist named Marcus, never asked questions and kept his security cameras conveniently malfunctioning. Jane arrived first, concern etched on her face. "Bernie, what's going on? David said you sounded strange." Before he could answer, David slipped in through the back door. "Senator, You're scaring me. Pentagon security called twice asking about your visit. Bernie held up his hand for silence, then pulled out his phone. What I'm about to show you. It changes everything. But first, I need your words that you're prepared for what this might mean. For all of us. Jane took his hand, squeezing it gently. We've faced tough fights before. Not like this, Bernie replied, his voice heavy. This isn't about policy or politics. This is about 50 years of lies that go to the heart of our democracy. He showed them the first set of documents. David's face went pale as he read, while Jane's expression hardened with each passing minute. These signatures, David whispered. These are people who testified under oath saying none of this ever happened. Bernie finished. Yeah. Jane looked up from the phone. Bernie, this is more than just corruption. This is a systematic manipulation of global events. He completed her thought. Going back decades, but it gets worse. He scrolled to the documents about the secret committee. The room fell silent as they read, broken only by David's occasional muttered curses. Look at the dates, Bernie pointed out. Every major foreign policy decision we thought we understood, Vietnam, Cuba, the Middle East, it was all orchestrated by this group. Congress, the president, they were just figureheads for the public to focus on. But why? David asked, running his hands through his hair in frustration. What was the end game? Bernie pulled up another document. Power, control. They created a system where they could manipulate not just American policy, but global events, wars, coups, economic crises, all engineered to maintain their control. Jane's academic mind was already connecting dots. The economic patterns we could never explain, the conflicts that seemed to come out of nowhere. All by design. Bernie nodded. But here's where it gets really interesting. He pulled up the memo dated October 1963. Look who signed this. David's eyes widened. That's impossible. He was supposed to be in Geneva that day? Yeah. History books say he was. Reality says he was here, signing off on something that would reshape the next 30 years of American foreign policy. The implications were staggering. Bernie watched as his wife and aide struggled to process what they were seeing. He hadn't even shown them the worst of it yet. There's more, he said quietly. Much more. But first, we need to talk about Operation Sundown. David's head snapped up. The classified file? You got it? I got it. And now I understand why they buried it so deep. Bernie's voice was thick with emotion. It's not just about what they did back then. It's about what they're still doing. Right now. He showed them the Operation Sundown documents. The room grew unbearably quiet as they read. Jane's hand found Bernie's again, squeezing so tight it almost hurt. Dear God, David finally whispered. If this gets out. When? Bernie corrected him. When this gets out. The American people have a right to know what's been done in their name. They'll come after you, Jane said, her voice steady despite her obvious concern. They'll try to discredit you, or worse. Bernie stood up, pacing the small room. They've been keeping these secrets for 50 years. People who tried to expose them, good people, they were silenced. Careers destroyed. Some died in accidents. That don't look so accidental anymore. So what's the play? David asked, slipping into strategy mode despite his shock. First, we secure the evidence. Everything I found gets backed up. Multiple copies. Multiple locations. Then we start reaching out to people we trust absolutely. Journalists who can't be bought or scared off. Jane interjected. We need legal protection too. If even half of this is true, we're talking about crimes that make Watergate look like a parking ticket. Bernie nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The documents had revealed a pattern of manipulation that went beyond anything he'd imagined. The secret committee hadn't just been making policy. They'd been playing chess with American democracy itself. A knock at the door made them all freeze. Marcus's voice came through. Bernie, there are some men in suits asking questions out front. Government types. The three exchanged looks. It was starting already. Back door. Bernie said quietly. David, implement Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was something they'd set up years ago for worst-case scenarios. Bernie had always hoped they'd never need it. As they prepared to leave, separately, Jane pulled Bernie aside. Are you sure about this? Once we start, I've spent my whole career fighting for truth and justice. He replied, his Brooklyn accent thickening with emotion. Everything else, all the battles, all the campaigns, it was just preparation for this moment. They could hear voices in the bookstore now, getting closer. Go, Bernie urged them. Different routes, just like we practiced. I'll contact you when it's safe. As Jane and David slipped out the back, Bernie took one last look at the documents on his phone. The evidence was clear. Decades of manipulation, countless lives affected, democracy itself subverted by a hidden power structure. But it was the Operation Sundown files that truly terrified him, because they showed that the conspiracy wasn't just history. It was ongoing. The same shadow group was still operating, still pulling strings, still shaping events from their hidden positions of power. Bernie Sanders had started this day looking for answers. Instead, he'd found a truth so explosive it could tear the country apart. But as he heard the footsteps approaching the back room, he knew there was no turning back. The lies of 50 years were about to be exposed, and the real fight was just beginning. The men in suits entered Marcus's shop just as Bernie slipped out through a hidden door behind a shelf of used history books, an escape route left over from the civil rights era. The irony wasn't lost on him. We just missed him, he heard one of them say as he emerged into the alley. Check the surrounding blocks. Bernie pulled his worn jacket collar up and hunched his shoulders, a trick he'd learned decades ago to make himself less recognizable. He walked calmly toward Constitution Avenue, fighting the urge to run. His burner phone, the one even his staff didn't know about, vibrated in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. Need to talk. It's Chen. Lieutenant Chen, the young archivist who'd chosen conscience over career. Bernie ducked into a crowded coffee shop before responding. Not secure. Need verification. The response came quickly. Operation Sundown, page 47, third paragraph. The sparrow flies at midnight. Only someone who'd seen those documents would know that phrase. Bernie typed back. 1 hour. Lincoln Memorial. East Side. He spent the next hour making sure he wasn't followed, using every counter-surveillance technique he'd learned over years of dealing with powerful enemies. When he finally approached the Lincoln Memorial, he spotted Lieutenant Chen immediately. She'd changed into civilian clothes but couldn't quite hide her military bearing. You're taking a huge risk contacting me, Bernie said as he sat beside her. They're cleaning house, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As soon as you left, they started removing files. Whole sections are being reclassified. Bernie felt his heart race. Operation Sundown? Gone. Along with everything connected to it. But she hesitated, looking around nervously. I've been managing those archives for 3 years. I made copies. Insurance, I guess. Never thought I'd actually need them. Why are you telling me this? Chen turned to face him, her young face marked by the weight of her decision. Because I saw what you saw today, and because my father was one of the people who tried to expose this 20 years ago. His car accident wasn't an accident. Bernie studied her face carefully. You're sure about this? There's no going back. Senator, I've spent 3 years watching them bury the truth. Today was the first time I saw someone try to dig it up. She slipped a small USB drive into his hand. Everything I could copy. Names, dates, operations. Things even you didn't get to see. Bernie pocketed the drive carefully. They'll know it was you. Already arranged my resignation. Booked a flight to my mother's in Oregon too. Very publicly. A grim smile crossed her face. But that's not where I'm going. Before Bernie could respond, Chen stood up. Watch your back, Senator. What you found in Operation Sundown, it's still active. They're not just covering up the past. She walked away, disappearing into the crowd of tourists. Bernie sat there for a while longer, feeling the weight of the USB drive in his pocket. Combined with what he already had, it was enough to blow the whole thing wide open. His secure phone buzzed. David had texted an all-clear signal. They'd set up a safe house, somewhere they could review everything without worrying about surveillance. An hour later, Bernie sat in a small apartment in Arlington, surrounded by trusted allies. Jane was coordinating with their lawyer. David was setting up secure communications. And Bernie was going through Chen's files, each new revelation making his blood run colder. "Look at this," he said, pointing to his laptop screen. February 1964. They didn't just influence policy. They were actively removing people who got in their way. Judges, journalists, even military officers who asked too many questions. David leaned in to look. Jesus, these names. Some of these people are still in power today. That's the point, Bernie replied. It never stopped. The same group, the same methods, just new faces in the old positions. He pulled up another document. See this? Every major military action of the last 50 years. They knew the truth beforehand. They let Americans die to further their agenda. Jane joined them, her face grim. Bernie, our lawyer says we need to be strategic about this. If we dump everything at once, they'll bury it in confusion and denials. She's right, David added. We need to build the case carefully. Show the pattern. Bernie stood up, pacing the small room. People have a right to know. Every day we wait is another day they get away with it. And if we move too fast, it all gets dismissed as conspiracy theories. Jane countered. We need to be smart about this. Bernie was about to respond when his phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. They know about Chen. She's gone dark. Watch the exits. Pack up, Bernie ordered, suddenly alert. We need to move. Now. As they quickly gathered their equipment, Bernie couldn't help but think about Chen. Another person risking everything for the truth. The list was growing, and with it, the stakes. The documents had revealed a pattern of manipulation that went back half a century. But Operation Sundown proved it wasn't just history. It was an ongoing campaign to control not just American policy, but global events. As they slipped out of the safe house into the gathering dusk, Bernie Sanders knew the next few hours would be crucial. The evidence was secure, but now came the hard part. Figuring out how to expose 50 years of lies without getting silenced in the process. The truth was in his hands, but getting it to the American people would be the fight of his life. The safe house in Alexandria was a far cry from Bernie's usual surroundings. A small basement apartment, lit by harsh fluorescent lights, walls covered with hastily taped documents and connection maps. He sat at a folding table, surrounded by printouts, from both his Pentagon photos and Chen's USB drive. His reading glasses perched on his nose. Bernie, you need to eat something, Jane said, placing a sandwich next to him. She'd been watching him work for 6 straight hours. How can I eat? He muttered, his voice hoarse. Look at this, Jane. Look what they did to their own people. Was deep into Operation Sundown now, and each page revealed horrors worse than the last. The documents detailed systematic manipulation of not just foreign governments, but American citizens themselves. David burst in through the back door, breaking the tension. Senator, we've got confirmation on those names you asked about. 3 of the officials who tried to stop this in '82. All dead within 6 months of filing their reports. Bernie pulled off his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. Not just dead. Accidents. Just like Chen's father. There's more. David continued, laying out fresh printouts. Remember Ambassador Wilson? The one who supposedly had that mental breakdown in '94? Of course. He was claiming there was a shadow operation running foreign policy. Look at this. David pointed to a document. 2 weeks before his breakdown, He filed this report. Bernie leaned forward, reading aloud. Evidence suggests systematic manipulation of multiple foreign governments through coordinated economic pressure and manufactured internal conflicts. Request immediate congressional oversight. He knew. He actually found proof. And they destroyed him for it. Jane added quietly. I remember the news coverage. They made him look completely unstable. Bernie stood up suddenly, knocking his chair back. Get me the files from 73 to 75. There's a connection here I'm missing. As David searched through their organized chaos, Bernie's hands began shaking again. Not from age or fear, but from pure rage. The evidence was overwhelming. American citizens had been unwitting test subjects in programs that violated every principle of democracy. Here, he said, spreading out documents across the table. Look at the pattern. Every time someone got close to exposing this, they didn't just silence them. They used them as examples to scare others away. A soft knock at the door made everyone freeze. 3 sharp taps, then 2 slow ones. Their security signal. A moment later, Sarah, their youngest aide, slipped in. Senator, they're moving faster than we expected. 3 more archives have been temporarily closed for renovation. They're destroying evidence as we speak. Bernie slammed his fist on the table. Damn them! They've had 50 years to perfect their cover-ups. Bernie, Jane said softly, laying a hand on his arm. Show them what you found in the domestic files. He nodded grimly, pulling out a particular set of documents that had been haunting him since he first read them. It wasn't just about controlling foreign policy. They were running experiments on American soil, social engineering on a massive scale. The room fell silent as he explained. The documents detailed programs that went beyond mere surveillance or manipulation. They had been actively shaping American society, creating artificial crises, manipulating markets, even influencing local elections. Look at these test sites. He pointed to a map. Every major urban center. They were using entire cities as laboratories. Sarah's young face had gone pale. But why? What were they trying to achieve? Control, Bernie replied, his Brooklyn accent thickening with emotion. Perfect, invisible control. Create the right pressures, the right crises, and you can make people beg for solutions. Solutions you've had planned all along. David, who had been studying another document, suddenly straightened. Senator, these signatures, 3 of these, people are still in office. One's on the Intelligence Committee. Now you see why they're so desperate to keep this buried, Bernie said. It never stopped. The same operation, just new players in the old roles. He found himself fighting back tears of rage when he discovered another set of letters. Desperate warnings from officials who had tried to stop it. Their careers had been systematically destroyed. Their warnings buried in this basement tomb of secrets. Listen to this. He read from one letter, dated 1988. I cannot stay silent any longer. What we're doing goes against everything America stands for. They call it national security, but it's about power and control. If you're reading this, I'm probably already dead or discredited. But the truth has to come out somehow. The writer had disappeared 2 weeks later. Died in a hunting accident, David noted grimly. A sudden noise from above made them all tense. Footsteps on the street level. Bernie, Jane said urgently. We need to move again. We've been here too long. But Bernie was lost in another document, his face growing darker with each line. My God, they're still doing it. Operation Sundown isn't just history. It's active, right now. The footsteps grew closer. Sarah peeked through a covered window. Black SUV just pulled up outside. How much time? Bernie asked, already gathering the most crucial documents. Minutes, maybe less. Bernie turned to his team, his voice steady despite the chaos. Everything we have has to survive. Multiple copies, multiple locations. If they get me, the truth still has to come out. They moved with practiced efficiency. Years of political operations having prepared them for moments Like this. Documents were quickly sorted, scanned, and secured. Bernie's phone contained the original Pentagon photos. Chen's USB drive held even more damning evidence. Everything was being backed up to secure servers even as they packed. The footsteps were right above them now. Back exit, David whispered. Cars ready 2 blocks east. Bernie took one last look at the evidence spread across the table. 50 years of lies, manipulation, and hidden power. The truth about how America had really been run, all documented in black and white. Senator, Sarah urged. We have to go now. As they slipped out the back door into the gathering darkness, Bernie clutched the most damning evidence close to his chest. In his decades of fighting for justice, he'd never imagined discovering something this big, this terrible. The sound of the front door being broken down echoed behind them as they disappeared into the night. The next few hours would determine whether the truth would finally see the light of day, or whether it would remain buried in the shadows for another 50 years. Bernie Sanders had spent his life fighting for transparency and justice. Now, with the weight of half a century's lies in his hands, he faced the biggest fight of his career. And this time, the stakes weren't just political. They were a matter of life and death. They moved quickly through the darkened streets of Alexandria, staying in the shadows. Bernie's mind raced with the weight of what they'd discovered. The documents in his possession weren't just evidence of past crimes. They were proof of an ongoing conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Cars just ahead, David whispered, leading them through a narrow alley. Suddenly, headlights flooded the alley from both ends. Black SUVs blocked their escape routes. This way, Sarah hissed, pushing open a rusty service door. They rushed inside, what appeared to be an old warehouse. We need to split up, Bernie said, his voice low but firm. They can't get everything we found. Jane grabbed his arm. Bernie, no, we stay together. Listen to me, he insisted, pulling out several USB drives. Each of these has everything. The Pentagon photos, Chen's files, everything. We all take different routes. Multiple copies have to survive. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Time was running out. David checked his phone. Senator, I've got confirmation. 3 more secure drops are ready. Just say the word. Bernie distributed the drives, looking each team member in the eye. Whatever happens, the American people need to know the truth. Everything we found, the manipulation, the experiments, the lies, all of it comes out. Heavy footsteps approached the warehouse doors. Remember the backup plan? Bernie continued. If anyone gets caught, the others keep going. No heroics. The truth is more important than any one of us. Sarah, the youngest of them, looked terrified, but determined. What about Lieutenant Chen? She risked everything to help us. She's gone dark for a reason, Bernie replied. Her father died trying to expose this. She knew the risks. The warehouse doors rattled. Someone was trying to get in. Jane squeezed Bernie's hand one last time. Be careful. I'll see you at the rendezvous. They split up, each taking a different exit. Bernie found himself in another alley, the sound of pursuit growing closer. The evidence felt heavy in his pockets. Decades of secrets that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. His mind raced back to what he'd found in Operation Sundown. The document detailed not just past manipulations, but ongoing operations. Programs that were actively shaping current events, controlling the narrative, eliminating threats to their power. A voice crackled in the distance. Target heading east. All units respond. Bernie ducked into a doorway, his heart pounding. He wasn't running for himself anymore. He was running for every person who'd been silenced, every whistleblower who'd disappeared, every American who'd been lied to for 50 years. His secure phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Watching from above. 3 men coming your way. Wait 30 seconds, then run north. Chen. She was still out there, still helping. Bernie counted down in his head. then sprinted north as instructed. He heard shouts of frustration behind him as his pursuers ran past his previous hiding spot. Finding a momentary refuge behind a dumpster, he pulled out one of the most disturbing documents he'd discovered. It detailed a program of systematic manipulation of public opinion, using artificial crises and controlled opposition to shape society itself. "My God," he whispered, reading it again. They weren't just controlling policy. They were engineering reality itself. More voices approached. Bernie tucked the document away and moved again, staying in the shadows. He thought about all the people who'd tried to expose this before him. Good people, patriots, who'd been silenced one way or another. His phone buzzed again. David this time. "Package 1 secured. Media contact ready when you are." At least some of the evidence was safe. Bernie allowed himself a moment of hope. They couldn't bury this forever. The truth was out there now, in multiple copies, multiple locations. As he made his way through the darkened streets, Bernie Sanders felt the weight of history on his shoulders. The documents he carried exposed 50 years of lies, manipulation, and hidden power. But more importantly, they proved that the system was still active, still controlling events from the shadows. The next few hours would determine whether the American people would finally learn the truth, or whether Operation Sundown would claim more victims in its endless quest for control. 2 days after the Pentagon visit, Bernie Sanders sat in an underground parking garage in downtown Washington, D.C., waiting. The scene felt like something out of All the President's Men, but the truth he held was far bigger than Watergate. "Are you sure about this contact?" David whispered from the driver's seat of their nondescript sedan. "Rachel's one of the few journalists left who can't be bought," Bernie replied. "She's broken stories about corporate corruption before. Never backed down." They'd spent the last 48 hours in a carefully choreographed dance of secure meetings and hidden document transfers. The evidence was now spread across multiple locations, protected by people they trusted absolutely. Footsteps echoed through the garage. A woman appeared from the shadows. Rachel Martinez, investigative reporter for the Washington Post. "Senator," she said quietly, sliding into the back seat. "Your message said this was important." Bernie turned to face her. "What I'm about to show you, it's bigger than anything you've ever covered. Are you ready for what that means?" Rachel's face was serious in the dim light. "Just like our previous stories?" "No." Bernie shook his head. "This is different. This could shake the foundations of American democracy itself." He handed her a tablet containing copies of the key documents. For several minutes, the only sound was her sharp intake of breath as she read. This can't be real," she finally whispered. "Every document authenticated. Multiple sources," David said, "including people on the inside who've risked everything to expose this." Rachel looked up, her journalist's instincts warring with disbelief. The implications, if even half of this is true. "It's all true," Bernie said grimly. 50 years of manipulation, hidden power structures controlling not just American policy, but global events, and they're still active, still pulling strings. "They'll try to stop this story," Rachel warned. "They'll come after all of us." "They already are," David interjected. "2 of our secure locations have been compromised. Chen's gone completely. Dark. They're cleaning house." Bernie leaned forward. "Which is why we need to move fast. The truth needs to come out before they can bury it again." Rachel was still scrolling through documents, her trained eye catching details. "These names, some of these people are still in positions of power. My God, the domestic programs alone. Now you understand why this has to be handled carefully," Bernie said. "We need to build the case methodically. Show the pattern." "I'll need to bring in others," Rachel said. "Journalists I trust absolutely. This is too big for one person or one paper." Over the next hour, they laid out a strategy. Multiple journalists from different outlets, each getting pieces of the story. A coordinated release that would be impossible to suppress or discredit. Later that night, Bernie met with another journalist in an all-night diner. Mark Thompson from Reuters had been covering Washington for 30 years. "I've seen corruption before, Senator," Mark said, reviewing the evidence. "But this is systematic, institutionalized." "Keep reading," Bernie urged. "It gets worse." Mark's face grew darker as he went through the Operation Sundown files. These domestic programs, they weren't just spying on Americans. They were actively manipulating entire communities, creating artificial crises. Bernie nodded. "Controlling reactions, engineering consent. The public will have trouble believing this, which is why we need veteran journalists like you. People with credibility who can't be easily dismissed." The next meeting was in a church basement with Sarah Chen, who'd finally resurfaced. Her father's old contact at The Guardian was with her. "They've cleaned out the entire archive," Chen reported, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Everything related to Operation Sundown, everything from that time period, all gone. But they can't erase what we already have," Bernie reassured her. "Your copies, combined with what I photographed, it's enough," The Guardian journalist confirmed. "More than enough. The real question is how to present it so the public can process it." Throughout that day and the next, Bernie met with more journalists in secure locations. Each meeting was a risk, but each one also meant the truth was spreading, becoming harder to contain. In his Senate office, surrounded by trusted aides, the weight of the decision pressed down on him. Release everything at once, and it could overwhelm people, make them reject what seemed too incredible. Hold back, and give their enemies time to prepare counter-narratives. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes, David argued. They already know we have the evidence. Jane, who'd been studying polling data, looked up. The public's trust in institutions is at an all-time low. They're ready for something like this. Bernie stood at his office window, looking out over Washington. The city looked peaceful in the morning light, but he knew better now. Behind those marble facades, behind the ceremonies and symbols of democracy, a hidden power structure had been pulling strings for half a century. His phone buzzed. Another journalist requesting verification of specific documents. The momentum was building. Newsrooms across the country were quietly preparing for what would be the biggest story of the century. "Senator," Sarah called from the door. "They're ready for the final coordination call." Bernie turned from the window. In his decades of fighting for truth and justice, he'd never faced a moment like this. The evidence in their possession would shatter countless Americans' understanding of their own history. The conference call connected them with journalists from major outlets around the world. Each had a piece of the story. Each had verified the evidence independently. "The question isn't just when," Rachel said over the secure line, "but how much to reveal initially. The full scope of this. It could be too much for people to process all at once." "The truth isn't always convenient," Bernie replied, his Brooklyn accent strong with emotion. "But democracy dies in darkness. Release everything. Let the people decide." The decision made, things moved quickly. Journalists began filing their stories. Editors scrutinized every word, every document. Legal teams prepared for the inevitable backlash. Standing in his office that final evening, Bernie Sanders watched the sun setting over the Capitol. By morning, nothing would be the same. 50 years of lies were about to be exposed. The comfortable myths that had shaped American politics for generations would crumble in the light of truth. His phone buzzed one last time. A message from Lieutenant Chen. "My father would be proud. Truth is worth any cost." Bernie thought about all the people who'd been silenced over the years. All the patriots who'd tried to expose what he'd finally uncovered. Their sacrifices would not be in vain. The first stories would break at midnight. By dawn, the world would know the truth about Operation Sundown, about the shadow government that had shaped global events for half a century, about the ongoing manipulation of American democracy itself. As darkness fell over Washington, Bernie Sanders stood ready for the storm that was coming. The truth was about to change everything, and there was no turning back. The lies of 50 years were finally ending, and a new chapter in American history was about to begin. The clock struck midnight. Bernie sat in his dimly lit Senate office, surrounded by screens showing different news websites. Jane held his hand. As they waited, David paced nervously, checking his phone every few seconds. "It's time." Rachel's voice came through the speaker. "All outlets are synchronized. Stories are going live. Now." One by one, the headlines began appearing. 50 years of shadows. Secret power structure exposed. Operation Sundown. The hidden. Control of American democracy. Decades of deception. Classified documents reveal massive government conspiracy. Bernie's phone immediately began buzzing with notifications. Senators, representatives, journalists. Everyone wanted answers. But it was a text from an unknown number that caught his attention. "Turn on C-SPAN 2. Now." David grabbed the remote. On screen, Senator James Morrison, one of the most powerful members of the Intelligence Committee, was calling an emergency late-night press conference. "These allegations are completely unfounded," Morrison declared. His face flushed. "Senator Sanders has clearly been misled by—" "Look at his left hand," Jane whispered. "He's shaking." Bernie leaned forward. "He's mentioned in the documents. Page 347 of Operation Sundown. He knows we have proof." The office phone started ringing. Sarah, manning the front desk, called in. "Senator, the majority leader is demanding an immediate meeting." "No meetings," Bernie replied firmly. "Not until morning. Let them read everything first." More headlines kept appearing. Shadow Committee, 50 years of hidden control. American democracy subverted. The true power behind the throne. Global manipulation. How a secret group shaped world events. Social media was exploding. Hashtags related to Operation Sundown were trending worldwide. The truth was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. "Senator," David called out. "Chen just sent an update. 3 more whistleblowers have come forward. Former archive staff. They've got additional documentation." Bernie nodded grimly. "It's starting. Once people see the truth, more will come forward. The dam is breaking." The office TV showed scenes of people gathering outside the White House, outside Congress, in cities across the country. Despite the late hour, crowds were forming as the news spread. "My God," Jane breathed, watching the coverage. "Look at their faces. They're angry, but they're not surprised. Deep down, they always knew something was wrong." Bernie's secure phone buzzed again. Rachel Martinez. "Second wave of stories ready. Focusing on the domestic programs. Are you sure you want to release everything?" He thought about the documents detailing how American citizens had been manipulated, how entire communities had been used as test subjects in social engineering experiments. The truth was brutal, but necessary. "Release it all," he texted back. "They deserve to know everything." Dawn was approaching. Bernie stood at his window, watching the sky lighten over the Capitol. The city was awakening to a new reality. One where the comfortable lies of the past were being stripped away. "Senator," David said softly, "they're calling for emergency sessions of both houses. The president is cutting short his Europe trip. The world is responding." Bernie turned to face his team, the loyal staff who'd risked everything to help expose the truth. "Whatever happens next, remember this moment. Remember why we did this." Sarah rushed in, her face pale. "Senator, you need to see this. They're admitting it." On screen, a visibly shaken former intelligence director was making a statement. "In the interest of national security, certain decisions were made. The American people must understand. They're scrambling," David observed. "The old playbook isn't working anymore." Bernie sank into his chair, exhausted but determined. The documents were out there now, spreading across the globe. The truth about Operation Sundown, about 50 years of manipulation and control, was finally in the open. As the sun rose over Washington, Bernie Sanders watched a new day dawn. The comfortable myths were crumbling, and with them, the power structures that had shaped American democracy from the shadows for half a century. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But the truth was out now, and there was no putting it back in the box. The lies of 50 years had finally ended. Now came the hard part: rebuilding trust, restoring democracy, and ensuring that the shadows could never again hide the truth from the American people.